Hello, good evening. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò. My name is Eugenio Refini and I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies here at NYU. I'm delighted, as always, to be introducing one of the many events that we co-organize with Casa Italiana. And of course, as always, very grateful to Casa Italiana for having us and allowing us to do all these wonderful things together. Tonight, we are particularly happy to welcome back a former student of our graduate program, Dr. Alessandra Montalbano, for a presentation and discussion of her recent book, Ransom Kidnapping in Italy, Crime, Memory, and Violence, which came out earlier this year with the University of Toronto Press. This is a beautiful book, if intense, addressing a very tragic chapter in the history of modern Italy, ransom kidnapping, a phenomenon that plagued Italy from the late 1960s through the late 1990s. This is the first in-depth study of the ways in which ransom kidnapping, both as a thing and as a cluster of discourses about it, permeated the very fabric of Italian society in the period. I won't say more about this magnificent book because we want to hear from the author herself and from her respondent tonight, and I cannot think of a better discussant for this book, our own professor, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. So let me just say a few words of introduction about our speakers before handing it over to them. And we will have a presentation by Alessandra first, and then a conversation between Alessandra and Ruth. So Dr. Montalbano is an associate professor of Italian at the University of Alabama. Her research interests focus on modern and contemporary Italian literature, culture, philosophy, and history. Her approach to Italian studies combines literary criticism, aesthetics, phenomenology, and gender and trauma studies. She is particularly interested in criminal and political violence and their representation in memoirs, media, and film, testimony and victim-centered narratives, the relationship between body and language, and feminism and biopolitics. These are topics on which, as far as I know, she's busy writing another book, so hopefully we will have yet another conversation sometime soon. Alessandra's interlocutor tonight is my esteemed colleague, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history and Italian studies here at NYU. As you all know, she writes about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and the threats these present to democracies around the world. Her book, Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present, first published in 2020, but with following editions and updates, seems to be destined to continuous timeliness, right? And this is a topic on which Professor Ben-Ghiat continues to write and speak about. And I cannot recommend enough her lucid newsletter, so please do check it out because that's a very lucid way of talking through all these questions. So without further ado, let's get started, and please join me in welcoming Alessandra Montalbano.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Eugenio, for inviting me to present my book here at the Casa Italiana, which is, of course, an important place for me, not only professionally, but at a personal level as well. I'm particularly grateful to Stefano for everything that he gave me, his support while I was living here in New York City, and to Ruth, of course, for her great mentorship, which, is still continuing. So thank you so much to both of you. Okay, so I would like to start this presentation with two images, the two Polaroids of Aldo Moro, taken and circulated by his kidnappers, the leftist and Marxist terrorist group, the Red Brigades, to prove that Moro was in their hands and still alive. Moro was the president of the Christian Democracy Party and had been prime minister of the Italian Republic several times. His abduction is the most well-known and remembered kidnapping in Italy. As many of you recall, the Red Brigades abducted him in March 1978, held him hostage for 55 days, and executed him on May 9th. His cadaver was left in a cart in the heart of Rome after the state refused to negotiate with terrorists. Today, these two Polaroids are iconic images of the terrorist violence, leftist and neo-fascist, that struck Italy between the late 60s and the early 1980s, a long decade remembered as the anni di piombo, the years of lead. The Moro abduction was indeed a traumatic and shocking event comparable for Americans to the 1963 assassination of President Kennedy. However, during the years of lead, terrorists were not the only kidnappers active in Italy. Sardinian banditry, Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia, and especially the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia, abducted people for ransom money all over the country. If the terrorists were responsible for 26 political abductions in total, between 1969 and 1998, banditry and organized crime kidnapped nearly 700 people, among them 158 in Lombardy, 128 in Calabria, and 107 in Sardinia. Of those 700 people, 489, that is 70% of the ransom kidnapping victims in the history of the Italian Republic, were abducted during the years of lead. In 1977, before Moro's abduction, the number of ransom kidnapping reached its peak, 75 in a single year. So when terrorists started to kidnap symbolic public figures in the mid-1970s, Italy had already been witnessing kidnappings for years. Sardinia was the first alarming region, to the point that in 1969, the Italian government created a parliamentary committee to examine the crime on the island. For a long time, and sometimes even today, the image of the kidnapper for an Italian imagination is that of a Sardinian bandit wearing the balaclava ski mask. In the late 60s, however, the crime was contained in Barbagia, the mountains of Sardinia, and the news about kidnappings were framing a distant and rural world still linked to the past and to the pastoral society to which banditry as a phenomenon belonged. It was in the early 1970s that Italy started to perceive ransom kidnapping as a modern threat linked to the economic development of the country and to organized crime, when Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta started to kidnap people outside of their regions, and especially in the north. Luciano Liggio, the boss of the Corleonesi, the Cosa Nostra syndicate responsible for the 1992 assassination of the anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, conducted abduction in Piedmont and Lombardy until 1974, when he was finally arrested in Milan after decades of being a fugitive from justice. After this event, Cosa Nostra decided to stop abducting because they did not want to have a negative visibility in their territories in Sicily and because they were already invested in other crimes. But it was especially the 'Ndrangheta that made ransom kidnapping a national phenomenon and an industry that forced Italy to know and pay the social price of living in a country with unscrupulous domestic organized crime. My book disproves two widespread beliefs about the violence of the second half of the 20th century Italy, that at a national level, violence coincided only with terrorism, and that mafia violence was only perpetrated among its own syndicates in the South. If 700 abductions give us the idea of the crime's proportions, my book investigates how Italy processed and framed this alarming national phenomenon. Historians of mafia often say that writing the history of the mafia only became possible when mafiosi started to talk, because the only way to break through the structure of an impenetrable secret organization is through the collaboration of its affiliates. I agree with this statement, but what ransom kidnapping allowed us to observe are the effects of the mafia violence in Italy. These effects tell us about the presence in Italy of territories completely under control of criminal cartels, where people could disappear for months or years and sometimes never return. Although in the mid-1970s, the numbers of abduction were very high, and Italians were exposed every day to the news of a new kidnapping, two cases particularly shocked and traumatized the country. Both were 'Ndrangheta abductions. The first was the 1973 kidnapping of Paul Getty III, the 16-year-old grandson of Paul Getty Sr., who was at the time the richest man in the world. Getty was abducted in Rome, where he was living with his mother and siblings. He was the first kidnapped person to be abducted outside of Calabria and held hostage in Aspromonte, the mountains in the south of Calabria. After him, hundreds of people shared the same destiny. Indeed, if the Barbagia was the natural prison of Sardinia, the Aspromonte became the natural prison of Italy. Gaddi spent 6 months in Aspromonte, and his captivity was unbearable. However, at the beginning, his kidnapping was believed to be a hoax and became a media sensation. Gaddi was presented as a spoiled and an unreliable teenager who wanted to access his grandfather's money. On the other hand, his grandfather, who did not want to pay for his ransom, became the embodied stereotype of the cold, stingy American rich man. Yet what emerges from these media depictions is anxiety. The international perspective of ransom kidnapping linked to the Gaddi abduction made this phenomenon no longer Sardinian or Calabria, but instead Italian. The media projected hostility toward the eccentric young and foreign Gaddi, with which civic society shared. But a shocking event happened. Poe's abductor cut off part of his ear and sent it to the Roman newspapers Il Messaggero. The Italian post offices were on strike, and when the ear finally arrived, it was no longer possible to conduct a medical examination. The Polaroid camera, however, was a technology used not just by terrorists. Criminal syndicates and Sardinian banditry were experts at this kind of instant photographs. Indeed, Gaddi's kidnappers circulated 4 Polaroids to prove that he had been mutilated. They did not use the post offices this time, but they hid the proofs on the side of a highway. When the photos were published, Italy was horrified, and the narrative about ransom kidnappings drastically changed. Even intellectuals participated in the public discourse. The novelist Alberto Moravia, for example, wrote an article on the front page of the Corriere della Sera denouncing the horror of the mutilation. If with the Gaddi abduction, ransom kidnapping became an Italian phenomenon, with the kidnapping and murder of 18-year-old Cristina Mazzotti, it became a national trauma. Cristina Mazzotti was abducted by the Ndrangheta in June 1975 in Eupilio, a small village close to Como, Lombardy, where she was spending the summer in her family's house after the end of the academic year. The daughter of a grain dealer, she was attending high school in Milan, where she was living with her parents. It was the first time that a young girl had been kidnapped for ransom in Italy. In public discourse and imagination, the Mazzotti abduction represented a story antithetical to the Gaddi kidnapping. The opposite of eccentric or foreign, Cristina was Italy's girl next door. The whole country waited with Cristina's family for the kidnapping's phone calls, especially after her father, Elio Mazzotti, paid the ransom without hesitation. Elio Mazzotti was depicted by the media as the antithesis of the stingy Paul Gaddi Sr. and represented the values of the Italian family ready to sacrifice everything in order to save their daughter's life. In September 1975, Cristina Baris was found in a waste dump near Novara, Piedmont. She was no longer recognizable, and the country was horrified. During her captivity, her kidnapper hid her in a hole in the ground that was so restrictive that she had to breathe using a plastic tube. She died because of an overdose of sedatives that her warder gave to her. Cristina Mazzotti's death was not just criminal news. It was a national traumatic event that made Italians perceive the phenomenon of ransom kidnapping as a state of emergency for which to suspend the rule of law. 2 years after Moravia published his article on the mutilation of Paul Gaddi's ear, Cristina Mazzotti's murder drove him to again take part in the public debate about ransom kidnapping. He did so with an editorial entitled Reflection on Horror, which clearly recalled his previous article. Prominent journalists such as Enzo Biaggi and Giulio Nascimbeni framed the effects of kidnapping violence through the traumatic memory of World War II. More than 25,000 people attended Cristina's funeral in silence. After her death, her family created the Cristina Mazzotti Foundation, among the first anti-mafia associations in Italy and still active today. The discovery of Cristina's body and her funeral shifted the center of gravity in the Italian imagination of this crime. Framing public discourse through the memory of the country's occupation during World War II, the narrative of the Mazzotti case depicted ransom kidnapping as historical and unforgettable. So with these 2 case studies, my book examines the pre-Moro media and cultural productions that built the narrative of kidnapping in Italy through the analysis of extensive archival material that includes, among other things, newspapers, television broadcasts, documentaries, films, and photographs. But it also explored the legal and political discourses that ransom kidnapping raised. The well-known issues of the negotiation that we often associate with terrorists and the Moro case started in Italy as an issue linked to banditry and especially organized crime. In addition to being responsible for the kidnappings in Calabria, the Ndrangheta were responsible for most of the abductions in Lombardy and beyond. The mutilation of Paul Getty and the death of Cristina Mazzotti opened a decade-long discussion on negotiating with abductors that shifted the public narrative from the horror provoked by the violence of ransom kidnapping and the initial civic engagement by the people of Lombardy who spoke out against the Ndrangheta, to the strong state that wanted to prevent the families from paying the ransom by freezing their assets. The argument of the linea dura, the hard line, that is, the state's refusal to negotiate with abductor, overlapped with Moro kidnapping and continued for years with the effect of targeting the families rather than bringing attention to the presence and power of organized crime in Italy. However, toward the end of the 1980s, this narrative completely changed. After a few years in which the numbers of abductions dropped, in the late 80s and early 90s, Italy saw a second wave of ransom kidnappings. In 1987, Marco Fiora, a 7-year-old child from Torino, Piedmont, was kidnapped and spent 17 months in Aspromonte in the hands of the Ndrangheta. The city of Torino mobilized, organizing, among other initiatives, a concert in solidarity with Marco and his family, and presenting a petition to the Italian parliament to take control over Aspromonte. In 1988, Cesare Casella, a 19-year-old boy from Pavia, Lombardy, was abducted in his hometown and spent 743 days as a hostage in Aspromonte. During his captivity, his city also mobilized, but it was his mother who took the most drastic action. She went to Calabria twice, chaining herself to a phone booth in the villages of the Locride, the heart of Aspromonte, imploring the kidnapper to free her son, and gaining the support of the women and the people of Calabria. The media and the country followed Angela Casella and her powerful political journey into the land of kidnappings, considered impenetrable and known by the Italians only from the perspective of the helicopters searching for the hostages from above. Her son Cesare was liberated after more than 2 years of captivity. Another example is that of Carlo Celadon, an 18-year-old boy from Arzignano, Veneto. Kidnapped in 1988, he spent 831 days chained in the caves of Aspromonte. Carlos was the longest ransom kidnapping in the history of this crime. He spent 3 birthdays with his warders. His captivity was unbearable. When he finally was freed, the press wrote that he looked like a concentration camp survivor. This is a photo of the Marcia dei Rapiti, the March of the Kidnapped in Rome, in which people from all over the country demanded Carlos and others' liberation. As we can see from these images, the second wave of abduction provoked a civic engagement against the Ndrangheta and kidnapping, and anticipated a massive anti-mafia movement raised in the aftermath of Falcone's assassination in 1992, and recalled the civic outrage when Cristina Mazzotti's cadaver was found in 1975. Solidarity towards the family and the victim is what distinguished this second wave of kidnapping that so long and dehumanizing captivities imposed especially on young people. While single traumatic events made the history of the country, Moro in 1978, Falcone in 1992, ransom kidnapping never stopped. This becomes visible on the pages of the newspaper L'Unità, from which Sergio Zavoli, a prominent journalist and expert on Italian terrorism, invited the country to extend the anti-mafia protest of hanging white sheets from windows in the aftermath of Falcone's assassination to express solidarity for the 6-year-old Farouk Hassan, abducted and mutilated of his ear in Sardinia by his kidnappers. Finally, a fundamental perspective through which my book approaches ransom kidnapping is the one of the victims and their testimonial narratives. Some of the kidnapping survivors wrote and published the accounts of their ordeals. I'm not going to talk to you about the details of the analysis that my book offers of these texts, but I want you to have an idea of what these memoirs allowed us to witness about ransom kidnapping. One thing to consider is that the Italian Penal Code classifies ransom kidnapping as a crime against one's patrimony, not against the persona or the individual. The kidnapper's intention to blackmail the families and obtain the ransom is what shaped the legal definition of the crime. It was not an easy decision for those in charge of writing the penal code, and the debate took decades. The fields of criminology and victimology also emphasized the objectifications that the kidnapped people suffer in order for the kidnappers to obtain their profit. However, the kidnapping memoir opens a window to another fundamental intention of the abductors, that is, to remain anonymous. We just need to compare Moro's and Getty's Polaroids to visualize the difference between political and ransom kidnappings. For the Red Brigades, visibility and propaganda were everything. In contrast, for the Ndrangheta, as well as Cosa Nostra and Sardinian banditry, being anonymous was everything. The media often called the ransom kidnappers anonymous sequestri, anonymous kidnapping. It was the kidnapper's intention to remain anonymous that shaped the captivity of the kidnapped victims. The captivity of ransom kidnapping was designed to turn the hostages into perfect and desperate negotiators with their families and to prevent them from testifying against their kidnappers. When you were kidnapped, your perpetrators did not put you in a room watching television, waiting for your family to pay for your ransom. The abductors completely dismantled their hostages, physically and psychologically. Being able to recognize their kidnappers was a death sentence for the kidnapped people, who were prevented from perceiving any noise or seeing their warders. Completely isolated, threatened, and unable to satisfy many bodily needs, the hostages were forced to write desperate letters to their families, imploring them to pay up. The memoirs of the victims testify to this violence, to the trauma of being suddenly snatched from the world, and to the challenges of re-entering society. These testimonial narratives cannot be framed by legal and criminological perspectives. For this reason, I use trauma studies, literary criticism, and philosophy to analyze them. From these perspectives, for example, we can recognize why some survivors decided to write memoirs and explore the traumatic bond they developed with their abductors, the famous Stockholm Syndrome, which is at the center of their text. But we can also witness ransom kidnapping as an experience of disembodiment, that is, an almost complete loss of bodily perception and a total loss of being perceivable by the world that bring the hostages to disappear, to become invisible to themselves. Seen from outside the legal frame, ransom kidnapping becomes, in the victims' testimonial narratives, a crime against the humanity of the hostages, not just against their patrimony. The kidnappers used systematic violence against people to obtain the ransom, yes, but it was a violence that attacked and used the human condition of being embodied, vulnerable, and capable of speaking. A violence, the memoirs tell us, that used a traumatic bond with perpetrators to make a profit from human relationships. To conclude, Italy was the country of ransom kidnapping before and after the Moro abduction made history. By looking at the media, political, and cultural mediation of this violent phenomenon from the 1970s to the late 1990s, my book gives to this history a different frame. If terrorists use abductions, such as Moro's attack, to attack the heart of the Italian government, organized crime and banditry use them to blackmail civil society and colonize the country's underworld. Today, while banditry has more or less disappeared, the Ndrangheta is one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Ransom kidnapping helped make this transformation possible. To remember decades of abduction tells us about more than a crime. It tells us about a national domestic threat and its power. Italy was, and still is, a country in which the state did not have complete territorial control, nor the monopoly of force, and where the price of its economic development was extremely high for hundreds of its citizens. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. It's a huge personal and intellectual pleasure to be here to discuss what you can see is a very important and amazing book published by Toronto, and it's difficult to comprehend the scale. Almost 700 people captured over 30 years, and there are journalists' accounts of this phenomenon, but Alessandra's is the first book of any length, I think, to really take such an interdisciplinary and multifaceted approach to this. And she brings the victims' voices and experiences forth through philosophical and literary analysis that she's trained to do, both from her studies here and also at the University of Verona. And she combines this really masterfully with historical reconstruction, media analysis. So it's very much an interdisciplinary treatment, which is what this subject demands, really. And you see, we're dealing with very, very difficult, very traumatic experiences and complex experiences that really can't be captured just by chronicle or history. And I want to say, just knowing Alessandra for a long time, if you read the book, I hope you will get the book and read it. Her work is distinguished by a total clarity of analysis and clarity of writing. And she's truly a model for us all. And she's always been like this. Her dissertation was like this. It's incredible, right? I would look and I would say, how can she write so clearly, right? And it's just who she is and how she thinks. And because of the gravity of what she writes, it's like there's almost a poetic value because the prose is so lucid. It's really great. So she can fare il punto. She gets to the heart of a situation because there's no excess in her writing, truly. And it's always been like that. So there's always been also a moral urgency and intellectual vivacity to have this clarity and this frankness. And so last thing I'll say, and then I have three blocks of questions, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll have some questions. So as you've seen, what the book is able to do is put these awful experiences inside a constellation of legal, media, historical, criminal. It's a story of crime, right? And it's a story of responses to crime. And the families of the victims are very present because of the circumstances in this book. And you managed to kind of show how the traditions of those families, the cultures of those families, they had to make very difficult situations, and they responded in very different ways. It's incredible, the mother who came and chained herself, and obviously not everybody did that. And the other thing that you do so well is show how the media coverage changed, and we got a little taste of it. But as more and more people, I mean hundreds and hundreds, it's unfathomable. How did the media succeed and often fail out of reticence to cover this adequately? And finally, at the end, you mentioned the disembodiment, and this is, I think you're able to do because of your philosophical training and your work from before and also here. I mean, these are a hole in the ground so small that Christina had to have a breathing tube. And what I was thinking of, being somebody who studies horrible things, that in North Africa, both under colonial things, but I know from testimonies in World War II, the French would put Axis prisoners of war they would bury them in the sand. They would make these holes and they would bury them in the sand as a punishment, the same narrowness, but they would only leave them there for a few hours or maybe a day if they'd done something very badly. I don't know from other experiences of a captivity like POWs, right, which Elena was also studied. I don't know of anything that comes close to this in the barbarity of and the extreme nature of this. So an analysis that gets that touches on an existential and has an existential and embodied value to it is really needed for this. So those are my comments, and I want to ask you how you got interested in this. And I know we had, you know, when you were writing your thesis and then the book, we had discussions about methodology, you know, how much should you include trauma studies, all that. But what has sustained you through this? You know, it's always a long journey to do a thesis and then make it into a book. What has driven you forward writing about this difficult material?
Well, first of all, thank you. In the aftermath of 9/11, with the wars in Afghanistan, I mean, there were like a season of kidnappings in the Middle East, and I was thinking, wow. I mean, I was like talking to friends here in New York, and I said, like, do you remember when like we were like every day exposed to this kind of news? And they, of course, told me no, because they were American. And so I realized how much it was an Italian phenomenon and how much was in my mind because I grew up there. So I was very interested in testimonial narratives, and it was probably also my way to, or my reaction to terrorism experience here. So I started to see if there were memoirs written by the survivors, and I find that they published. So I started from there. So the last part of my book is in reality the part that I wrote at the beginning when I started this project. And then I wanted to see the kind of narrative in Italy. So that is how I started, and I realized how big it was. So from my memory, I discovered that it was really, really, really big, and we don't remember that period that much. Although it's coming back right now, a lot of cultural production are on this year, last year, so it is clearly something that Italy need to process. So I think I was one of the people that started to remember something that is still there, and it was traumatic for I think for the country, not only for the family.
Yeah, because you're really opening up. I mean, it's a very different view of organized crime. It's a different view of the victims. It's a grassroots versus an elitist in a way, and it's more threatening. I'm going to have a question for you after about memory, but so here's a question about. This is a book about the evolution of organized crime, and so you say in the book that banditry has more or less disappeared, but the Ndrangheta is one of the most powerful organizations in the world, and this season and this type of kidnapping is how it became that. Also, I imagine financially and from the sheer number and visibility. So can you say, for those who haven't read the book, you know, was this high number and very concentrated and intense, you know, wave of kidnappings that was sustained for a very long time, was that a symptom of can you say more about how that's a symptom of a moment of transformation? Like, yeah. How did they sustain this? How was this a kind of politica dall'alto? You know, was this something that like the heads decided and it was very disciplined, and who got to carry them out? Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I think that one of the problems for, like, I think that it's not super visible how important those years were for organized crime, because terrorism took over all the attention. But just comparing the numbers, we see how active the Ndrangheta was at that time. But even if we think, while I was studying, I realized that, for example, the court in Turin and Catanzaro, which were both two extremely important cities for terrorists because the trials happened there against the Red Brigades. The name of this court are after two judges, and both of them were killed. And a lot of people think that they were killed by, especially in Torino, by the Red Brigades. He was killed by the Ndrangheta because he was the one that was investigating Ransom Kidnapping. The same thing happened in Catanzaro. So we have a kind of map of memory that we don't remember. And we don't know, it's not that clear because there is always this overlap with the violence of the 70s and what the Ndrangheta was doing. And when I was preparing for this, putting together Moro and Getty, I mean, the grandson of the richest man in the world and the prime minister of Italy for many years, I mean, we see two organizations, it is clearly the economic transformation of Italy. One used capitalism, which is the Ndrangheta organized crime. The other one was fighting against it. And they were using the same kind of crime, which is kidnapping. But the money that Ndrangheta raised really changed the game for this organization. They invested money. And I didn't have time, of course, in my presentation, but Ndrangheta, like Mafia, Cosa Nostra, decided by itself to stop the kidnapping in 1991 because at that point they no longer needed it. They really invested the money that they raised to in other kind of crimes like drugs especially or weapons. So those 10 years are extremely important also because the way the state started to fight against organized crime, it was the same way it was fighting against terrorism, but there are two very different phenomena. And you cannot fight in the same way against terrorism and against organized crime. The same thing about the linea dura, the firm line. It is completely different to be a politician being kidnapped or a citizen being kidnapped. It's in the Constitution that you have to save the life of the hostage.
Whereas I think I wrote down when you were saying that it was considered an offense, we were looking at each other like against patrimony. So it's almost like it's a financial crime instead of a crime against a person, which
it is.
It's incredible. And the other thing is comparing them is, the point of terrorism was to disseminate chaos and fear in a highly populated place, in a public place, the disruption, that was the whole point. Whereas this seems that they went into urban places, they took the victims, and then the violence was hidden, and they were also taken to places that were already forgotten, like Aspromonte, among the most, forgotten, rural, difficult to access places. And so I think that matters too if we're doing some kind of comparison.
Yeah, but it was forgotten, but it was at the center of an economic power. So the problem with these organized crime syndicates is that Calabria itself and the people of Calabria were kind of hostages of this criminal organization because they were making a lot of money in a region that is in reality very poor, a forgotten place. But in the book I call it extraterritoriality because it is completely not under control of the state. And so you have not only the hostages, but the people living in this region that are controlled by other power rather than the state. So this is something that it became really clear, but at the end of the 80s, early 90s is not that long time ago. I mean, it's yesterday.
No. This is organized crime. So, but the fact that they stopped, because they didn't need the money anymore. Because also you mentioned that they didn't want that negative reputation, but they had no problem having a negative reputation for everything else they were doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but kidnapping is something that society doesn't like, of course. But for the Ndrangheta, it was different than Sicily, because Cosa Nostra did not use Sicily as a prison, right? They were kidnapping in the north, and everything was there. Only until 1974, 1975, something like that. For the Ndrangheta, I mean, think about it. They were kidnapping people in the north, which means that you have to bring the people from the north to the south. It means that you're traveling all over the peninsula and nobody like stopped them. So it was also a kind of, you know, it shows how powerful they were. And so it was they were very well organized because unlike Cosa Nostra, the Ndrangheta also had colonies in the north. So today we keep saying, you know, we are like shocked that there is mafia in the north. It always been there. Like it was there. I mean, this phenomena show us that they were already there. And so there were Andrine, which is the name of the groups of the Ndrangheta, based in the north, organizing the abductions. And then there were like other groups that were organizing the trip. And then there were groups organizing the captivity and the negotiations. So it was really an industry, as criminologists call this organization. And we are talking about, at the beginning, like big names that were kidnapped. Getty, right? I mean, Bulgari. I mean, it's so weird for me because every time I walk somewhere and see these big names, and I say, oh yeah, his grandson was kidnapped in that year. Oh, the other one in that year. So all of them were kidnapped, and so you realize how big it was, and so I think that it's something that there is something that we are missing about the fact that how well organized Ndrangheta was.
Yeah, and so my last block of question, comment is about the memory and about silences. And so one thing is, you know, what is the memory culture about this phenomenon? And really I was thinking though, it's so threatening because of the power and because what you say in the book and also in the talk that it exposes that large areas of the Italian state were not under control of the Italian state, large areas. And this is where we go back to the volume of it, the hundreds and hundreds of people, the ability to take people all across the peninsula. That's very threatening. There are people who don't want you to talk about that. Now, terrorism, small cells, highly organized, not of the same scale as these organized crime. So, and you have a decapitation strategy. It's a lot more manageable for people. So there was something extremely threatening about, I think, talking about this lack of control, and well after it ended, because it hasn't gone away, and indeed it empowered the biggest criminal force of today. And I also think, as I said before, the barbarity, the extreme circumstance and nature of the captivity, that's threatening that could go on and nobody could do anything about it. So these are things that you could say that there was like in Italian, a rigetto, like a reluctance or not wanting to deal with it, not really wanting to, and of course it could be dangerous to deal with it, there's all of that, but not wanting to really deal with it precisely because it's so extreme and so broad based. Is that
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Totally, because you discover not only that, you know, like in the country there are these very violent groups that can use violence, but also the state is not protecting you in a certain way, because the same people that were these things were also the people that were like corrupting the state and do all these kind of things and having protection and not going to jail. I mean, Luciano Liggio, when you read his story, who is basically the one that started kidnapping at a certain level, he's the one responsible, as I mentioned before, for Falcone and Borsellino. He's responsible for so many things. I mean, the Corleonese, we always have in mind Corleone because of The Godfather, but like it's Luciano Liggio and all these social effects of the violence of mafia that is what is the reality of Italy. One very interesting perspective that Ransom Kidnapping gave us, because it happened in the north, is that if you think about it, like the fact that they prevent people from testifying, it's like suffering from a giant omertà, right, during your captivity, which is the point. Silence is the point of organized crime. But they were kidnapped in regions that they were not under control of organized crime. So people could, they spoke out, they started. Unfortunately, I think it is a big problem. The fact that the country was so focused on terrorism prevent a kind of momentum, especially after the Mazzotti case, of, like people were writing letters to the president of La Repubblica, asking to intervene, asking to do something as per Monte. So Italy was well aware of the danger of this organization, but also the fact that the state was not doing that much.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we can. Do you want to say anything else? We can take some questions. Yeah. Are we passing around a mic, or? Yeah, we can. This gentleman.
Hi, thank you very much for this. Professor, it appears from the money transfers that most of these were successful financially for the Ndrangheta and others. Were they all publicized, or were most of them kept quiet? I mean, was it only the few that came to public attention, or did most of this happen in private transactions which were never really publicized?
So the cases I presented here are those that kind of build the narrative that we can observe and study. But I mean, it was a daily news, so people were following what happened, and they were successful in getting the ransoms. But I also have to mention that among these 780 people, for example, never returned. And so it's a big number. And there were like very sad story about, families paying the ransom and maybe the victims or the hostage was already dead. Like Christina, it happened exactly that. She died the day before her father paid for the ransom. So it was all over the news. So that is also the reason why they started to talk about the linea dura, and the state want to appear as the strong state, and preventing the family. At a certain point, the perception was that the reason why the phenomenon was so big, it was because the families were paying the ransom. But it is a very tricky thing. And I tell you just one thing, because I can't talk forever about the negotiations, because I am not a big supporter of the linea dura for one reason, because we have numbers. So Lombardy is the region, it's a rich region. They were kidnapped in there. The Ndrangheta had Ndrangheta there, so they were very, very well organized there. So it was also the region in which it wasn't a law, the fact that you could freeze the assets of the family. But as a magistrate, as a judge, you could apply that rule. So in Lombardy, there was that rule. So in the region where you were in theory not allowed, or your assets were frozen by the magistrate, is the region that had the biggest number of kidnappings. So it does not really work. What the state really need to do was to control the money laundering. That was the big problem.
I just want to add, was there any, I'm fixated on this thing that it was considered a crime, a financial crime, against patrimony and not against a person. Was there any pressure to try and change this? I ask that knowing how static the legal culture is, because this seems just redoubling the offense, and the dehumanization, to just not even consider it a crime against a person.
Yeah, so it was very difficult to place that crime in that place of the penal code, but they did that because I think it's a technical thing. If it is against the patrimony, it means that it's also kind of against the state. And so the state can use that idea of preventing the family from paying the ransom, but it is in reality, it is a problem because the only way to reach them, to reach the kidnappers and actually investigate them, is through the negotiation. So in 1991, after Casella and after all these long kidnappings, the state actually finally, and it was like a big thing, they wrote the law. And so there is the blocco dei beni, it's called in Italy. There is this law. But in reality, they applied a couple of times at the end of the 90s. It did not work. So now we have a penal code with that, a law that is, the strong state preventing the families from paying the ransom. But in reality, every time they try to use it, it doesn't work. So what they do is to control the payment and follow the families. But the problem is that even if you pay, if then you neutralize that money and they cannot use it, that could be the solution. Because even if you prevent a family from paying for the ransom, you would never stop a family to pay. Other people will give them the money. It becomes a black market.
Yeah. Okay, we can take.
Alessandra, that was so amazing, as expected, and I can't wait to read this. And you've done such important work in decoupling the other ransom kidnappings from the political story. But I was just wondering, while we're here, if you could briefly flip that back, and since we can't account for the political ransom kidnappings in terms of lack of territorial control or organized crime. Is the political phenomenon just a repetition of something that's in the air, right? It's an effective strategy that clearly terrifies people? Or is there some deeper crisis of the state or cultural narrative that makes kidnapping really powerful in Italy, even beyond the specific reasons that the Cosa Nostra or the Ndrangheta or the Red Brigades would appeal to it for?
Thank you, Shane. Great question. To answer, I'm going to use Natalia Ginsburg because she wrote an article in 1978 while Moro was still a hostage. And she wrote this article, which when I read it, it is amazing. And she said that it was like, I think this is when the Pope intervened, and because Moro asked for his help. And so she said, we are living in a time where you can have a political perspective or a non-political perspective on what is happening in Italy. I am on the side of non-political perspective. And she says, why? And she says, I'm not surprised or shocked that the Pope, I think he needs or something like that, because of Moro. I think you should to do that for some of these kidnapped. But why he did not do that? And she said for Cristina Mazzotti. And so she said and she talked about the image that I show you, the waste dump, and she said that was the horizon of the landscape of Italy, the imagination of Italy when terrorism started. It was already opened because, and this was, of course, the parallel is always with the past and the fascism and everything. She was part of that time. And she said something like, nothing in history happened suddenly or like that. You always need to prepare society to arrive to a certain point. And she basically said that ransom kidnapping, especially organized crime, the Ndrangheta, opened a certain kind of imagination of civic environment in which then terrorism and the terroristic violence was not even a surprise. So they opened the door for them. So I think that, and also, in Italy, a lot of kidnappers became kidnappers in jail. And in jail, there were a lot of criminals and terrorists at the same time talking about how to organize kidnappings.
So it's more porous between the two, and so it makes it all the more interesting that this history has been largely ignored and the other has been triumphant in a way. Yeah. We can take another question.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation and completely new to so many of us. So thank you for that. My two quick questions, I hope quick. First of all, in the United States, we have a very perhaps romanticized vision of organized crime because of, you mentioned Corleone, obviously The Godfather, and The Sopranos more recently. Is there a similar romanticization of organized crime in Italy? And then second separate question is, how much political influence does organized crime have in terms of corrupting the actual government? We hear of such things, but is that accurate? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. And so the first question, if there is, there is to the fact that a film like The Godfather is a masterpiece, and how can you not, but there is more than a romanticization. I will say, like, reading the media, when I was reading about trials, for example, when Luciano Liggio was in the room, there is a fascination for these men in general everywhere, because they are powerful, because they don't follow the rule, because they are above the law, because they can do whatever they want, and they do. So there is always this kind of, but then it depends on which perspective you're looking at the thing. So, for example, in the media production, even in fiction, for a long time, until probably Gomorrah with Saviano, but for a long time, the perspective in fiction was always the perspective of the state, right? Like you always identify, never with the bad guys, but always with the people in charge of fighting against organized crime. So I think that there is much more romanticizations of the crime here in the United States, for sure, but also because it's also connected to the Italian-American identity and the values of the family. There is a mix of other things here in the US, for sure. And the second question was about the influence. Oh yeah, it is. There is a big influence, of course. The Ndrangheta had a big influence on power, but Sicily and Cosa Nostra, I mean, there are, like, we have documents that, like, show the collaboration. I mean, even someone like Berlusconi at a certain point had someone to protect him from being kidnapped in his villa in Arcore. Mangano is his name, because he in 1975, actually Berlusconi, his family had to leave the country because they tried to kidnap his son. And so many people were leaving the country because of that reason. So there is always, at the political level, but also at the personal level, these powerful people, a kind of, gray zone between the two powers. So yeah.
And just to add, and then Berlusconi found a partial, it was never a solution. He was always going to be exposed because of his wealth. But he ended up having his right-hand man be Marcello Dell'Utri, who was convicted of mafia association in 2003 and kept on being a senator, because why not keep on being a senator? And then it had to be upheld by the Supreme Court, and that didn't happen for like almost another 10 years. But he was his right-hand man. Yeah. He actually was also given titular control of Berlusconi's Publitalia, the public affairs conglomerate. So he was right in there, and he was the liaison to the mafia.
Yeah.
And that's also to Opus Dei, the same person. So that's another story. But and he still was exposed.
Yeah.
So, but one of the lessons here is, not everybody's Aldo Moro or Berlusconi, but anyone can be Cristina or the other faces that you showed. That's what's so scary about it. Are there any other questions?
Sorry. There's also one other thing, like when you talk to people in Italy or people my generation, like one of the things what do you fear the most? That it was being kidnapped. I mean, even if they would never kidnapped me, because my family would have nothing, but like still in the imagination of the young people, that was, but even in literature, the evil in Italian literature is kidnapping. I mean, I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with Ferrante, L'amica geniale. I mean, it is the base, it's a novel structure on a kidnapping. And so the little girl, I don't want to spoil it if you didn't read it, but it is completely, she brought, so the most famous friendship in literature, not only Italian literature, this point, and international literature that ended because one of the friends wrote the story of her best friend. It wasn't the romance that ended their relationship, but the fact that she wrote the story of this woman, basically her memoir, right? So he took her trauma and wrote a book about her, and she at that point left and disappeared because that was too much her story. And it tells a lot about, you know, the ethical limits of telling the story of trauma, someone's trauma.
So we'll take one more question. Yeah, over here.
Thank you. Congratulations, Alessandra. It's a pleasure to Teresa to sit in this, you know, such interesting forum. I can't wait to read it. And yes, I want to corroborate your point. We were glued onto the TV screens, following the stories. We were terrified by these stories when we were young, and so that's why I followed your work, because it speaks powerfully, I think, to our generation. Small detail struck me. The Mazzotti Association is still active, and I'm kind of curious what they do after all these years. And maybe this is also linked to my broader question about why is this topic now becoming more popular? I'm thinking of films, as you mentioned before. What's happening in terms of collective memory in a way? Does it mean that we have processed, or does it mean that we still need to process?
Thank you. I think that we are starting to process that. Like I just saw yesterday that they made, theater is a very active field in the things. They made a theater play about, it's a monologue, about what happened to Cristina, and it's called 5 centimetri d'aria, I think. They just made now, this year, like 2 months ago, one about Celadon. So all the people that I named today, they are doing something. They also made a film about him last year in 2023. So I think it is something that it's really coming back to our memories. There are podcasts about it. Carlo Celadon spoke about his experience after 20 years. And so there is a podcast about that. There's another podcast about Cristina Mazzotti as well. The Cristina Mazzotti Foundation, so her niece took over the foundation now. They are very active in, you know, they go to school, they bring this memory back, but they are very active in a kind of pedagogical idea of legalità, right? Like Libera, for example, maybe you know Libera, which is the other anti-mafia association run by Don Ciotti. They often collaborate. So basically, they are like invested in education and in anti-mafia, anti-crime issues. Every year, since Cristina Mazzotti passed away, every year in Opilio there is a race. Like it's, I don't know, like 15 kilometers every spring in her memory, still today. So yeah,
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good ending point. Thank you so much.
Thank you.